Our people are our stories, our past is our knowledge, and our culture is our future. Relive our first encounters, experience the stories of removal from our homelands, feel the spirit of our people, and the determination to continue thriving as the great unconquered and unconquerable Chickasaw Nation. Join us in experiencing our stories, the Chickasaw Heritage Series.
It is my pleasure to introduce First Encounter, the first documentary installment within the Chickasaw Heritage Series. The Chickasaw Heritage Series will feature history-based documentaries and educational videos written and produced entirely by the Chickasaw Nation. Through the Heritage Series, we're able to tell our stories and inform others of our history, culture, and traditions. We're able to relive moments in time that are of great significance to the Chickasaw Nation, Chickasaw people, and other Native American tribes. The First Encounter documentary portrays an important time in Chickasaw history. It documents the devastating impact Spanish conquest had on indigenous cultures in North America during the 16th century, specifically the Hernando de Soto expedition. Throughout our long history, the Chickasaw people have found themselves at the forefront of great events. This was especially true when De Soto and his entourage arrived in 1540. Our Chickasaw ancestors played a major role in the ultimate failure of De Soto's excursion into North America. The expedition achieved what historians call the Columbian Exchange. Their visit permanently altered the social, political, and ecological environment of the New World, thus ushering in a new age. The First Encounter documentary portrays the actions taken by the Chickasaws that proved to be the catalyst for the dwindling of Hernando de Soto's mission for gold and riches in America during the late 1530s and early 40s. It was many years before our Chickasaw ancestors encountered Europeans again. The battle with De Soto was a pivotal point in Chickasaw history and set a standard for the persevering warrior spirit Chickasaws are still known for today. From Chickasaw removal in the 1800s to the establishment of our new government in Oklahoma, we have upheld our persevering spirit as a nation united by our people. The Heritage Series is a part of our mission to enhance the overall quality of life of Chickasaw people and presents transformative tribal history from a Chickasaw perspective. We hope you enjoy the film. As we build upon our Heritage Series, we continue to reflect on our past and build toward our future.
It was their proud history as fierce warriors that designated the Chickasaw as the Spartans of the lower Mississippi Valley. They were known in the Southeast and beyond for their untiring ability to preserve their independence and sovereignty in the face of countless enemies. In the mid-14th century, after a series of migrations, the Chickasaw were setting up highly functioning societies in present-day Mississippi.
They came there as migrant peoples, but they created for themselves a major civilization. They created this civilization by organizing themselves socially. Next, they organized themselves spiritually, and lastly, they organized themselves politically. You can see it mainly in the artifacts that are found from this Mississippian period. These are the types of things that show us that there is a major civilization going on. Anthropologists and archaeologists refer to it as the epitome of civilization before European exploration on the North American continent.
Though the Chickasaw were a relatively small tribe, They claimed large hunting areas in present-day Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Not only were the inner workings of the tribe highly organized, the Chickasaw had trade networks that spanned the continent.
Many of the trade networks functioned socially or diplomatically just as much as economically. These trade items were not necessarily commodities that were necessary for subsistence or daily life, but somewhat exotic.
This would have been things like shell artifacts from maybe the coast, conch shell cups, maybe some copper plates. Certainly women would have been making and using basketry. Goods that would have been imported in from different areas around the southeast and even as far away, say, the Great Lakes.
In the winter of 1540, however, the Chickasaw became one of the many Native American tribes who were subject to an unwelcome European visitor, Hernando de Soto.
Hernando de Soto had been a lieutenant, if you will, under Pizarro in the conquest of Peru earlier in the 16th century. So he had been present for the conquest of a Native American people, and he was expert in the techniques of exploitation and subterfuge. This is a pattern we see in the Southeast that De Soto used repeatedly because he knew it was effective.
De Soto's fleet dropped anchor on the shores of what is now Florida in May of 1539. 9 ships carried hundreds of men, horses, pigs, and war dogs. Although they were on a mission of exploration and conquest, they were also hoping to exploit the indigenous people's riches and establish new colonial settlements. The conquistadors were heavily armed and proceeded to plunder, ravage, and murder their way through south and central portions of North America, enslaving hundreds of indigenous people as they went.
When he came to Florida, he expected to find silver and gold. He was a seasoned conquistador, a ruthless, cruel man. He wanted the glory that went with the gold.
The way the Spanish government did all this was, they said, okay, if you can conquer it, you can exploit it, but you have to give us a cut. And that's one of the reasons that they sent people along to keep an eye, to make sure that they were gonna get what they were supposed to get, according to the original agreement.
And so what De Soto was after, pure and simple, was conquest and riches. It's clear from reading the Chronicles that the Spaniards didn't have much concern about how they got that.
De Soto and his men came with unfamiliar animals, armor, materials, and technology. Many natives were in awe of this and perceived the Spaniards as otherworldly. Taking advantage of their unfamiliarity, De Soto convinced some of the tribes that he was an immortal sun god as a ploy to gain their submission without conflict. As winter approached, De Soto decided to forego a camp in Florida and chose instead to seek gold, rumored to be mined toward the sun's rising. Not suspecting that these rumors were a strategy used by the Native American tribes to get De Soto to move away from their villages, the expedition then turned northeast through what is now Georgia. During the climactic Battle of Mabila, De Soto heard of the Chickasaw and of their lands, rumored to be rich with fields of maize. After months of traversing through present-day Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama, De Soto and his men arrived in Chickasaw territory in December of 1540. The two came face to face on the opposite banks of the Tombigbee River. Warriors showered the Spaniards with arrows, and despite the rigid reception, De Soto commanded his troops to construct rafts. They eventually crossed the river, where they settled in an abandoned village. Despite their initial reluctance about the Spanish invaders, the Chickasaw became curious about the non-natives, the likes of which they'd never seen before. The Chickasaw decided to pull back and reassess the Spaniards, both for diplomatic and strategic purposes. With their armor, weaponry, and overwhelming presence, the Spaniards intrigued the Chickasaw. De Soto used this curiosity to his advantage, taking several Chickasaw men hostage and sending word that he wanted to see their chief. Mikalusa, the principal Miko of the tribe at that time, and the other head Chickasaw men remained hospitable to the Spaniards.
They were trying to find a way to overcome De Soto. So it was a relationship that was complicated, and it was about power, and ultimately, of course, the Chickasaw won.
If war was the best interest for the Chickasaw people, then he would decide on war.
One of the chroniclers of the expedition stated that the Chickasaw presented them with food, hides, and blankets, and offered De Soto their services.
At the beginning, I mean, obviously, it's much more efficient if you can just persuade the people to, like you and give you what you want and be friends and allies and all the rest of it. So he started off that way. But when it came to anything that thwarted his requirements, he did not hesitate to use violence however he needed to.
De Soto did try to assert authority, if you will, over Chickasaw leadership and the tribe as a whole. Like most Spanish of his time, they came from a culture that believed that they were far superior to most everybody else in the world, especially Native people, and that was the attitude that they took with the Chickasaws.
In the dead of that winter, De Soto's soldiers looted the Chickasaws' food supply. After watching their reserves beginning to diminish, 3 desperate Chickasaw men were caught trying to reclaim stolen food from the Spaniards' camp. Needless to say, the punishment from De Soto was swift.
He had 2 of the thieves killed with crossbows, and he had the 3rd one returned to the chief without hands, as a message of this is what happens when people steal from the Spaniards.
Still, a cautious peace remained. The Chickasaw realized De Soto wouldn't depart their territory until spring, and De Soto remained vigilant and suspicious of the Chickasaw.
The Spaniards wrote that it snowed when they were at Chickasaw, and that this snow lay almost a foot thick on the ground, which is a very rare thing for North Mississippi, and that it stayed for 2 weeks.
It was a massive snowstorm. Scholars have found that this was actually a period of a mini ice age, and houses that they found in the town of Chickasaw were not enough to house his 400-plus men, and they were cold and they were hungry. It wasn't enough.
By late February, as the weather moderated and spring began, De Soto announced that the expedition would be moving forward.
They had counted on getting supplies from the indigenous people. That was part of their whole way of doing things. And that was one of the reasons that they were sort of bulled around and sort of tried to subjugate people. This did not make them any friends, and they were attacked multiple times as they crossed the southeast because they would just push everything too far.
As with many tribes before, De Soto approached the Chickasaw leadership and made outrageous demands. His orders included 200 Chickasaw men to carry his baggage, herd his hogs, and build and serve his camps along the trail. De Soto also demanded that several young tribal women would be furnished to serve his soldiers.
The Chickasaws were unwilling to subject themselves, their men or their women, to the sort of demands on them that would be made by accompanying the Spaniards along the trail. So the decision must have been made to attack the Spanish and drive them from the province of Chickasaw. And the result of that was the night attack.
In order to buy time, the Miko requested that the issue be put before his tribal council before answering. De Soto granted the chief more time. But instead of considering De Soto's demands, the Chickasaw planned an ambush on the unwelcome visitors. In the weeks prior to the ambush, Chickasaw warriors had made several reconnaissance trips to De Soto's camp. On these trips, the warriors assessed the operations of the camp, looking for patterns and weaknesses. Perhaps all his prior plundering experience honed his intuition, because De Soto rightly suspected that the Chickasaw were plotting an attack.
The Chickasaws would come in the night and howl or sing in a frightening manner to the Spaniards, and also beat drums. Night after night after night this occurred. The Spanish armed themselves and prepared for an attack, but none came. As it turned out, this was a strategy to lull the Spanish into complacency in preparation for the attack the Chickasaws knew that they would eventually have to launch.
Despite De Soto's preparation and vigilance, his men were worn thin, tired and vulnerable from the Chickasaws' many visits. On that evening in early March, he told his assembly of men, "I will sleep armed and with my horse saddled," and the soldiers agreed to do the same. By the time of the attack, the warriors knew well the manner in which the Spanish soldiers slept and how they guarded themselves while occupying the tribe's abandoned village. More than 300 Chickasaw warriors crept into their camp early in the morning, carrying small clay pots full of smoldering herbs. Using the pots and arrows wrapped with the same herbs, they set fire to most of the structures. Spanish soldiers, mostly undressed and unarmed, ran out of their houses and were met by a barrage of Chickasaw arrows. Dozens of soldiers were killed and wounded, along with 50 to 60 horses. With much of their clothing, uniforms, and equipment burned up, the wounded didn't have much to salvage. One chronicler said that it was a great mystery of God why the entire group of Spanish weren't wiped out. However, it was a southeastern Indian custom to strike a hard but quick blow without losing any men. This remained the Chickasaw strategy for centuries.
It was strike and retreat, show your opponent who's boss, punish them. I think these are the strategies of Mississippian warfare.
It is still not known why, despite De Soto's demands, that the Spanish were unprepared for the ambush. Armed men and horses were assigned to guard the camp that night, but the vulnerability of the camp could also be attributed to De Soto's arrogance. He simply did not believe he could be defeated by the Chickasaw.
De Soto's men by this point, I think, were so disaffected with him. Soto was not a good leader, and it was clear he was maniacal, and I think his men were losing faith in him, and so I think they ignored him.
After the smoke cleared, the Spaniards, many naked and unarmed, moved on to another camp to recover.
They held up in a small abandoned village not too far from where all of this took place, and they attempted to make a plan to leave the territory.
De Soto moved on for good, forever weakened and demoralized. On May 21st, 1542, De Soto died from complications of fever before getting the chance to leave the mainland. In order to hide his death from the natives and uphold his constant claims of divinity, his men sunk his body in the Mississippi River.
Certainly in the case of the Chickasaw and the Hernando de Soto expedition, there are two sides, big time, and it's important that we hear both of them.
De Soto's mission was really a failed mission. He was a failure in the eyes of his men, and a failure in the eyes of people in Cuba and Spain who expected him to return again a glorious conquistador with lots of diamonds and gold.
"150 years would pass before the Chickasaw would once again encounter Europeans attempting to enter their homeland in an attempt to colonize.
The Chickasaw, from that first encounter on up, became somebody that you wouldn't want to cross. Part of what history is about is telling your own story. The Chickasaw have a stake in understanding the records of their past because it tells a story that's much, much different than the one that I was taught of the colonization of the Southeast.
The Chickasaws are one of very few who survived in their homeland, in place, maintaining their sovereignty through the Spanish, the French, the English, and all these periods of colonial aggression. The De Soto legacy for the Chickasaws is the beginning of a period that is still unfolding today. The Chickasaw story is not over.
The conflict with De Soto and the Spaniards left a mark that resonates through the pages of history, a legacy of being unconquered and unconquerable.